All right, family and friends, welcome to the CounterRevolution podcast. This show is committed to exploring the purpose and meaning of education, and why Christians must have a Christian philosophy of education, and why we must reclaim education as a ministry of the family and the local church. The theme for this podcast is that compulsory education is often seen as a necessary system to ensure all children receive a quality education. But the question we're asking today is, what if these laws are actually a form of government overreach, coercion, and even tyranny? In today's conversation, I am going to be talking to attorney and author Kerry Lee Morgan, who argues that compulsory schooling violates parental rights, religious freedom, and individual liberty, and should be abolished altogether. His article, The Tyranny of Compulsory Education, lays out the case against the government's role in dictating how children are educated. As I said already, I am very excited for this conversation. Without any further ado, I give you my conversation with attorney Kerry Lee Morgan. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, Kerry Lee Morgan. Kerry Lee Morgan, welcome to the CounterRevolution podcast.
Well, thank you. Enjoy being here.
Okay. So, Kerry, before we dive into our subject line for right now, the conversation, please, if you don't mind, can you share with our audience and myself a little bit about yourself and what you do and just your passion and all that good stuff?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. Well, my name is Kerry Morgan. I'm an attorney. I practice law in Michigan. I'm also licensed in Virginia in the District of Columbia, and am admitted to practice before various federal courts in the federal system. I've been practicing law 40 some years and really enjoy it. We focus on labor law, constitutional law, employment law, employment discrimination. Our firm also represents housing cooperative organizations, and back in the day we did some homeschooling defense work, and we represent special interest organizations like nonprofits, rescue missions, gun rights groups. And so that's sort of the practice. We are litigators, so we do litigation. I've lived here a number of years here in Michigan. I'm married. I've got 5 kids, all grown up, and we are involved with a website, the Lonang Institute, LONANG.com, which we have endeavored to articulate the particulars of the God's law as it applies to the nations, as distinguished from the laws of Israel, of the ancient Hebrews, and how that applies today. We file amicus briefs in the Supreme Court, attempting to educate the judicial branch about their obligations to observe this law that binds the nations as understood in a constitutional framework. So that's probably more than your readers want to know or care to know, but that's a pretty good overview of what we're about and what our passion is.
Yeah, very good. I'm excited to talk to you because I have read a few things that you've sent me and other things on the website, but specifically today, I wanted for us to talk about compulsory education, your article that you sent me, um, titled "The Tyranny of Compulsory Education." Um, may I ask, if you don't mind, what inspired you to write that?
Sure, sure. This goes back quite a ways. In my master's degree program, I wrote a master's thesis on the Federal Department of Education, and that's in the news today. I see that President Trump has issued an executive order to eliminate or significantly reduce that agency. Well, I wrote a thesis on that in the 90s, which explored the American history from the founding of our nation, the Constitution, up through the Bush and Clinton administrations, and tracked the expansion of the federal government moving more and more into education, something which was constitutionally prohibited to it. That in turn led me to be involved in parental rights with regard to the education of children and defending parents charged with their children charged with truancy in local courts, and developing arguments to permit them to exercise their duties to God with regard to directing the education and upbringing of their children, and how to put that into a pleading, how to make that practical rather than just theoretical. That led to further led to publishing a book in 1997, which was published by University Press of America. It's available on Amazon, titled Real Choice, Real Freedom in American Education, which outlined the unalienable right of parents to direct the education and upbringing of their children, and do so free from state interference, regulation, and control. I couldn't really, that book also contained model legislation to disestablish the state control of education, which I couldn't interest really any legislators to review, let alone implement. Nor were the Christian educators or the Christian legislators interested in that. They were off on trying to make the curriculum better. And so I wrote the article you referenced, The Tyranny of Compulsory Education, to really underscore the seriousness and the very pragmatic effects of government compulsion in education and its adverse consequences to the family, hoping that, quote, pro-family organizations would see they're missing out on this major attack on their rights and the education and upbringing of their children. So that article was an attempt to raise the stakes. Let's really look at what we're talking about and move from the theoretical to the practical. So
what basically what you're saying is that education in America is not truly voluntary. Are you also saying that it is based on force, like their force, it's by force?
right. Every state has some form of compulsory attendance law or compulsory education laws, and parents are legally obligated to ensure their children attend a government regulated school. It could be a government regulated and controlled public school. It could be a government regulated private parochial Christian Catholic school, or it could be a charter school, which is a government controlled school, or it could be a homeschool, which in Michigan, for instance, are subject to some regulations on minimum curriculum. Many other states have greater regulations, including teacher certifications. That was a big issue for a while. Parents didn't have a degree. They couldn't educate their children at home. And mandatory curriculum. Some states have a mandatory number of days you must be in your home school. Some don't. And of course, the other is that, you sometimes they require parents to notify the local school district that their children are being educated at home. In some states, they have to get permission. In other states, they have to show their curriculum to the public school superintendent and get it approved. And in the worst states, they have to have their children tested according to state mandated testing in certain grades, and file forms and this sort of thing. So, we speak in terms of government regulation of education from the public school on down to government regulated homeschools. There are some states that the regulations are nil, and that comes much closer to the honoring the right of parents to educate their children according to their own will, as led by by God who gave the children to them. The children came about not by an act of the legislature. They came about by the will of the parents. And so it's their responsibility, their duty to their creator to ensure that their children are taught about God and are taught, his laws and right and wrong and how to get along and make yourself useful to take dominion and follow through with the commands of God with regarding society. So, but compulsory attendance, compulsory education, these are mandatory in every state, and many states, if the parents fail or refuse to ensure their children are in a government approved institution of whatever kind, they are subject to fines. Typically, a local ordinance would impose a $50 fine, for instance. State law typically imposes up to $500 fine and or up to 90 days in jail for failure to abide by the compulsory attendance laws. And in the worst cases, the state moves to take the children away through a juvenile delinquency proceeding, calling the children delinquents and not able to be controlled by the parents and removed from the home and educated through the state's system of education, through a group home or some other non-familial setting.
I'm curious. Do you know what the law is in Pennsylvania for homeschooling and all that?
I did at one time. My sister educated her children in Pennsylvania. I believe they had to report to the superintendent and maybe be tested. The Homeschool Legal Defense Association will give you a backgrounder on every state. HSLDA's website in Virginia will have a backgrounder, and you can review the details there.
Okay.
So,
you mentioned earlier truancy laws. Can you elaborate on that?
yeah. So your typical truancy statute, I'll use Michigan as an example. The law provides that if, let's say that the parent, this is sort of a typical case, the parent, sends the kid to a public school, but the kid skips out and, doesn't go to school. He just refuses. So what happens is the parent gets a letter stating that your son or daughter is truant. And the parents may say, oh, I didn't know that. And they make sure he's there, or the parents may say, I don't think that he should be in your school. I'm doing some homeschooling. I'm doing education. Leave me alone. The truant officer, that is a police type officer with legal powers, may come to the home, knock on the door, make an inquiry, write down, the number of children in the home, their names, their grades, and ensure that they're all in a school or a government-approved school, or they're legitimately being homeschooled. Legitimately meaning they satisfy the state's definition of what it means to be a homeschool. And if the child doesn't attend the school, then a summons is issued, and the parent must appear in typically a district court, a state district court, and answer the charge. The judge's goal is first and foremost to ensure that the parent get the kid in a school. And if the parent resists or says no or is unable to, then fines and/or jail time may result. So they have this process. It's set up by statute.
You also mentioned that the government can take the children and basically care for them in a non-familial setting. I've heard liberals sometimes say out loud that the children belongs to them or belongs to all of us. Joe Biden said it. These are not just your children; these are all of our children. Where does that come from? Do you know where this kind of thinking originates?
Well, I think it originates with the concept that the state, and they say we're our children, like Hillary Clinton said that, it takes a village to raise a child. It's this mentality that it's a community effort. It's merely reinforcing what assumptions underlie compulsion in education. That is, it is the duty of the state, it is the right and power of the legitimate state of the civil government to compel children to be in attendance and be exposed to government approved ideas so they can learn to read and write. And this is on everybody because, well, if the children can't, then they're going to be a burden to the society, meaning a burden to the government in later years. And that's why the state's claiming some kind of a paternalistic interest. They usually aren't that blunt. They usually say this is a shared obligation between the federal government, the state government, teachers, and by the way, and parents too. But of course, this is simply a declaration of job security for teachers, and most state laws give teachers some kind of a monopoly in this area. Particularly if the government requires a teacher certification to teach. But I think that's sort of the mentality. It's the mentality that the government owns the children, and you're just here to take care of the messy parts of the early years and change the diapers and, get some basic discipline. But then at kindergarten, at 5 years old or 6 years old, you should turn the child over for the good of the people, for the good of the country, for your own mental health. Parents are considered somewhat incompetent. They're considered rather, dolts and unable to educate their children, and they're too busy with their job and making money to pay taxes and live in this society. And we're really helping you out, and a lot of parents buy into that. They don't think that. They think maybe if they thought it through and they're Christians or they know God, they should be thinking, well, God gave me this child and I don't have a PhD. I don't even have a bachelor's degree. And guess what? That's not part of what's required. I'm the parent. God gave this child to me. He wants me to ensure that this child receives a basic education in life and in knowing him. Of course, that's his first goal, knowing him. And knowing how to take dominion. You know, the Genesis tells what mankind and womankind's duty is with family and with the ground and the land and occupation and vocation and learning to make your way in this world. These are all great biblical concepts that parents should be educating. And you don't need a, matter of fact, I think the more you're educated formally, the less you understand this and the farther away you get from it. And you're considered backwards and ignorant. But that's not how God looks at parents who try their best to educate their children.
Right. Funny thing just happened recently. I was watching a Dr. Phil video in which he had on there someone he was interviewing, and they're both complaining that some state school systems are putting uncertified teachers in the classroom because there's a historic teacher shortage. The public school teachers are quitting at really high numbers. And so the lady is complaining that the government shouldn't do that. They shouldn't put uncertified teachers in the classroom. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, well, the certified people are quitting. What do you want the government to do? They have to have somebody in that classroom. So now, you know, people that are pro public school education would argue that these laws exist to ensure that all children would receive a basic education and are protected from neglect. So assume we remove these laws, wouldn't that lead to a system where disadvantaged children fall through the cracks?
Well, I think we have to look at the current successes of the system. I read an article just the other day about a lawsuit filed by a high school valedictorian who sued her public school because upon graduation she could neither read nor write. If you look at where the United States lands on testing, I think I read an article the other day that like 60% of fifth graders can't do basic math, and some high 70-some% can't read, can't read a paragraph. And so we're always hearing about the need for raising standards in the public system, the public school, the most government controlled school. Also, it's against the law, where there's no legal basis to sue your public school if your children are not educated. So if you file an educational malpractice suit here, like in Michigan, that'll be dismissed in that you can't hold the public school accountable. So when I hear people say, well, we've got to hold parents accountable, are you being held accountable? And the answer is there's no legal accountability for compelling a child to attend school 180 days a year for 12 years and not having received a basic education in reading and writing. Also, I'd like to note that being ignorant, being unable to write, being unable to read is not neglect at all. It's simply a condition that could be ameliorated, and but that standing in and of itself isn't in the law a definition of child neglect. If it was, we'd have school systems and school teachers being found guilty of that crime or tort. But of course, they have immunity. They have governmental immunity. They are not able to be sued. And yet they want to hold parents to the standard to which they themselves are refused to be held. But setting aside all of that, my experience with parents are that parents know their children much better than the teacher in the classroom. The teacher in the classroom has to deal with 25 or 30 students every hour. Maybe they have a total of, I don't know, 100 students, or if it's an elementary school, it's the same teacher, and they're teaching the student all day. But parents generally love their children. They want the best for their children. I've not really met any parents that got out of bed every morning and said, what can I do to keep my child uneducated today? What can I do to keep them ignorant and down? And if they do something criminal with their children, or they physically abuse them, or lock them in a closet or something, then we already have laws against that, and those children will be removed. But that really has nothing to do with education. But if I took a poll of public school teachers, I go there, it's a job. Maybe I really care about little Johnny or little Jill, or I care about the students in my class, but I don't go home and I don't live with them. And if they're not learning, I'll give them a failing grade. Maybe I'll be nice and help out. I think we all had a favorite teacher in school. I went to a public school. I had favorite teachers that I liked and were, helped out. But again, parents are in a far superior position to know what's best for their children, what their children need. Now, let's say that parents do this, but they say, I'm overwhelmed, they don't care. That's on them. If they're not willing to lift a finger to educate their own children, then we could expect their children to turn out like children are being turned out now from government schools, which is not good, because the mandatory curriculum of a government school is what I call practical atheism. You're not allowed to talk about really God as a real person, a real being, a real God, and so you're defaulting to the secular norm of the system. And what is God's view on this subject? Fine, you don't want to educate your children. Your children probably aren't going to take care of you when you're old. You're going to be subject to government oversight. You're going to be regulated by the government. You're going to be, your health and your life and your future will be controlled by the government, because you weren't a good parent. Frankly, you neglected your children, and now you shouldn't be surprised that your children have neglected you. God is not going to be mocked. If a parent sows neglect, they'll reap it. And that's a law of nature that no one can say, by my will, I will void that consequence. That's not a law of the land. That's just the law by which God operates. So, let's get to the final analysis. Your question: what about those children that actually do fall through the cracks, and they are ignored by their parents, and they don't go to school, they're totally delinquents?
Mm-hmm.
Then that's what they are. That's the situation. I think that number will be significantly small. It'll certainly been smaller than the number that are currently in that classification in the entire government-controlled system. So we shouldn't put on parents a level of perfection. We should understand parents are fallen as well, and have problems. Sometimes can't deal with it. But I think we're supposed to, in this culture, have churches and voluntary organizations and Christians who are supposed to love their neighbor. And I would say in those situations that these organizations should stand ready to help and fill those gaps and plug those gaps. The fact that they don't they may not, or they don't, is a indictment on the hypocrisy that they may be showing. But again, this is sort of God's plan. The family is the first obligation to do this. Loving neighbors, friends, and the church is the second. And if they won't do that, then that's the kind of society we're going to have, where some children are not, that fall through the cracks, and as you state. But, Thomas Jefferson said, if the people in a local city don't want a school, let them remain without one. He said it's better to permit the father, in this case, to be wayward and delinquent than to force everyone into a system of a local education. That's how he balanced it. He said, let that be, but it doesn't justify a system of mass control and indoctrination.
Yeah, I was also thinking too that the welfare state, progressivism through the welfare state has managed to destroy uh, uh, a big percentage of the citizenry here in America, and I believe maybe in the West in general, um, to a point that uh, the level of self-government required to um, leave parents with their children is yeah, I don't know. I think I agree with your second point that the solution is with the church and the Christian freestanding nonprofit organizations that would have to rise up to respond to the crisis. I mean, we are in a crisis with regards to education and just pagan society in general. Um, so, so how do you address then the issue that the idea that education is a public good, like roads or emergency services that benefit society as a whole?
Yeah, so we're talking again government control of ideas in education, whereas a public good, like the government paving roads, and of course, historically roads were not government roads, they were private easements, but overlooking that, or police, local constabularies or police forces of whatever size. These involve the use of, force, civil force, civil power. But education is principally about ideas. What is true? What is false? And so I don't think the public good analogy really holds, because what the government is doing is it's stating in its curriculum, these are the ideas we think every child should know and to which every child must be exposed. And sure, they can choose not to believe it, but if I have a child and I tell the child 180 days for 12 years, this is true, believe this, I'm teaching you this, I don't know of any real child that will say, well, I was told that for 12 years, but now that I'm I'm graduated from high school, I don't believe any of that. I don't believe any of it. I think that mandatory and compulsory repetitive exposure is something that gets into your mind. Jefferson said that God made the mind to be free, and that any effort by the civil power to influence it or compel it or constrain it are against the author of our religion, our holy religion. And if you think about it, if I say to you right now, you as an adult, whatever you do right this very minute, do not, under any circumstances, in your mind, picture what a Christmas tree looks like. Okay? Well, I would assume more likely than not that you had this image in your mind for a second. of a Christmas tree with the lights and ornaments, whatever your particular exposure has been. But through my speech, I've essentially told you what to think about. And if I did that for 12 years, I think you would have a pretty clear idea of what I'm talking about. If I said that you're not, that your gender is fluid, that you can choose whatever you want to be, and I said that for 12 years, you might probably come out of there concluding that your gender is fluid. It's up to you. Of course, it doesn't take that long for me to say at one time. Now you have knowledge and you can reject it and throw it out of your mind, just like the Christmas tree evaporated from your brain when we started talking about something else. But the whole goal of the other 11 years of indoctrination is to get you to accept it and believe it. And so that's the thing. It's the mind. In my understanding of God's law and God's authority, he never gave any person other than parents the right to dictate or direct their children to be exposed to specific ideas. He never gave it to my neighbor. My neighbor has no right to dictate what my children shall know. 10 of my neighbors have no right to dictate what my children shall know. 100 of my neighbors have no such right. And if they got together and said, we're a city and we're going to build a public school, and in that school that you must attend, the community dictates what your children shall know, they have no authority for that. If you even think about God, God doesn't force people to believe. He doesn't even force people to believe in him. If you decide not to, that's up to you. And he typically doesn't use the sword of coercion. He doesn't put you in jail. He doesn't threaten to fine you if you don't believe in him, or you don't attend church, or you don't listen to his word or read his word. He's a lot more tolerant and open-minded than the government is about this matter. He says this is the truth. It'll set you free. If you don't believe it, then that's on you. Whereas the government says if you don't believe it, at least you have to learn it for 12 years. You have to be told time and time and time again. Particularly when it comes to ideological things, political things, value systems, being taught in as young as elementary school. So that's why it's not a public good. It's not a public right. It's dealing with the mind. The civil government has no jurisdiction over the mind. Your neighbor has no jurisdiction over your mind. Your neighbor can tell you, I think you should believe this, and you can say, I agree, I don't want to believe that. Your neighbor should say, I'm going to talk to you about my views, and I guess what, I can get up and walk away. Child cannot get up and walk away. Matter of fact, we filed a brief in the Supreme Court last week challenging the Montgomery County, Maryland School Board's mandatory indoctrination class of elementary school students to sit through gender clarity and learn that their bodies are their own, and that they can really choose to be a man or a woman. And also said that don't tell your parents this, because they will oppose that, and that is going to interfere with, that's going to harm you psychologically if you talk to your parents and they say that's not true. And then the parents learned of this, and a Muslim parent, a Jewish parent, and a Catholic parent learned of this. They got a lawyer, they filed a lawsuit, and they said, let us opt out. Let us at least opt our children out of that, which is a good position, but in the big picture, it's pretty weak. I mean, they could pull their whole children out and educate them themselves, but let's go with this. And the school system said, no, you're homophobic, you're a white supremacist, they called them all kinds of nasty names. And they said, if you take your children out, we'll prosecute you for truancy, and we'll make your children are in the school. So that's before the Supreme Court. It'll be argued sometime here, but to rule on whether that violates the parents' religious freedom. But the real issue in the case that's never been argued or hasn't argued, except we found a brief saying this, is like, where did the government come into the power to compel children to be exposed to any ideas? And they have none. God never gave it to the people, never gave it to my neighbor or a group of neighbors or 1,000 neighbors, and they don't have any right to set up a government by our consent, which takes away my authority over my own children, which God gave to me. I'd like to say that Christians had a good understanding of that position, but they don't. Typically, in a public school setting, they argue for curricular changes. They want good curriculum that consistent with their religious views, and they don't mind that it's all backed up by guns, the bayonet, the jailhouse. As Von Mises says, the jailhouse, the bayonet, and the machine gun. That all backs up the state's force and violence against the child to be in attendance. They don't care about that. They think that's okay as long as they're forced to be exposed to good ideas. And so I say that even if the public school curriculum tomorrow was 100% teaching about God and Jesus Christ, it still would be wrong. It still would be contrary to God's authority over a parent, because it's based on coercion. It's based on a mandatory attendance, mandatory curriculum. That's extremely difficult for many Christians to accept. They can't see that. They don't know that God never gave human beings most of his power. They think that he gave them a lot of power that they don't have, a lot of authority, when in fact he never gave any man or woman the authority, my parental authority or my wife's parental authority over our children, to educate them and expose them to true ideas.
Yeah. So I find that two things. One, I find that the church has decoupled, separated education from discipleship, under the idea that a lady named Nancy Percy calls the secular sacred split. I think Francis Schaeffer started that idea. But anyway, under that understanding of truth, education is left under the secular bucket, and then discipleship is left in the sacred or the spiritual bucket, and they're separate, which is to say that anybody can educate your children. It has nothing to do with discipleship. As long as you disciple them at home, you'll find parents that argue for sending their children to the government schools to become salt and light there. But yes, I agree with you that even if the government was a Christian government, getting involved in education is to operate outside of their jurisdiction according to the word and law of God. So you said in your article that God alone is the Lord of the mind. He has said it should be free from compulsion. He has not empowered the civil government to compel a child to be forcibly exposed to government approved ideas. God does not even use force to compel exposure to his own superior ideas. How is it then that puny Caesar claims any legitimate power to compel exposure to the inferior ideas of men. Question there, as I just said about um, discipleship and education and things, many Christian parents and teachers believe they can be a light in the public schools and bring faith into the system. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. You know, take a 7-year-old, and who are they trying to influence but other 7-year-olds? They may be able to talk at a very rudimentary level about Christianity if it's in the home, but and let's say they do, and let's say, just for facts here, that other students become Christians through this ministry, this Salt and Light ministry. Doesn't that good result warrant or, justify? Okay, but at what cost? This kind of conversation cannot happen during fourth hour science. It can't happen during first hour, reading. It happens maybe between a class or in the lunchroom or on the school bus. And it happens in, less than 30 minutes a day opportunity. What's going on the other 6 hours in that day? Is the child being salt and light when it hears a lecture on evolution? Is it being salt and light when it hears a explanation of history that has no reference to God working or his omniscience or his omnipresence? What is going on in the English class when my ABCs, are the Alcoholic Beverage Commission rather than Adam, B, I don't know, Barney, some biblical reference. This was the McGuffey readers, right? The McGuffey readers were all about biblical concepts and introducing the child to the Bible and to Christianity and God and his law. The other 6 hours of the day, the child is being exposed to a curriculum built on a single proposition. That is, if God is alive or relevant or existent, he has no relevance to what we're going to teach you. He is not going to be mentioned. He is irrelevant. And we can explain the world and all of the topics and disciplines without reference to him. So again, 12 years of 6 hours a day of this teaching of practical atheism, and it's all justified because the student has a maximum of 30 hours to win souls. No student has the mental capacity to resist that onslaught unless their parents deprogram them every day. And I know of no parents that deprogram their children every day, because the parents think everything is good because little Johnny is getting good grades and little Johnny is popular and little Johnny wants to play sports and he can do that. And little Johnny is being socialized and he's learning to get along with other people. And little Johnny isn't buying drugs at school. Little Johnny is in 6th grade. He hasn't yet had sex with anyone. And so my child's turning out pretty good. And so this is okay. They don't deprogram their children. They don't say, what did you learn today that, was contrary to the scripture? And the parents don't know it because the parents aren't taught themselves. You go into a typical church. I don't know about you, but I've never heard a sermon about the duty of parents to educate their children free from governmental coercion. I have heard many sermons and thanking our public school teachers in the congregation for all the good work they do in helping little Johnny between class. But of course, um, that's because, and the preacher is not going to speak against this. He's not going to say government control of education is contrary to the laws of God, because the deacon's wife is a public school teacher, and maybe one of the elders is a superintendent of public instruction, and maybe 25% of his congregation is somehow owes a livelihood or a living to the government system of control of education. And if he speaks any words negative, or maybe even if he supports homeschooling and says parents should have the choice, then that's all taken by school teachers, Christian school teachers, as an attack on their, their financial well-being, their future, their pension, their collective bargaining agreement. Yeah, on and on it goes. And then they show what? They show that they're little Johnny, and helping little Johnny is not the first priority. It's the last priority that must be subordinated to my own self-interest. Oh, those bad Christian school teachers. No, they're just people. They're looking out for their own self-interest, which is not a bad thing. But let's not confuse that with evangelism or Christian compassion or helping your neighbor or loving your neighbor. And the church, of course, the pastors are particularly weak in this area. They have a mortgage. They have their kids need braces. They have to live in this society. They're not going to, by and large, risk any controversial subjects from the pulpit. It'll be the same thing every week: evangelism, discipleship, personal growth, uh, no election sermons, no politics, no thinking about government from God's point of view. Uh, Maybe a Romans 13, we have to obey the government thrown in there every 5 years, every 10 years, so I can satisfy that group in my church that wants to hear what God might have to think about this. But can you really blame parents if they don't read the scriptures? They're not getting it in church. And if they went to a government school, hey, it was good enough for me. It's good enough for my kid. Look, I didn't turn out so bad, did I? Maybe you didn't. But, do you know God? Do you know anything about his laws? Or are you able to tear down every vain argument that sets itself up against the knowledge of God? And your children, your 7-year-old son, salt and light, he cannot tear down any vain argument that he hears 6 hours a day. If you think your children can do that, I'd like to meet them, but they cannot tear down. There's a power structure in the classroom. You're not going to do that. You try that in college, you might last the semester. You might just kick out of college if you stand up and you say to the professor, look, I know you're well-meaning and you have a PhD, but I think you're fundamentally ignorant of the facts here. My experience in college, that those kind of comments didn't turn out well. So you can't expect that out of a 7-year-old. So I think the salt and light argument is just nonsense. It's just something made up to hide or conceal their failure of the whole system to, honor God's way God made the mind and the duty of parents, and the laxness, the failure of the church to teach the whole counsel of God.
Yeah, I think I do think teachers, sure, um, can go in the Christian teachers and try as much as possible to be a light, I guess. I think sending children is unreasonable, and the salt and light argument um is not even a good one. And also when people say, they're going to send the children there, and then when they come home, they're going to basically deprogram them. The amount of deprogramming that would have to happen uh to successfully undo what's being done, you might as well homeschool your children at that point.
Right.
um if you have time to do that, then you're already homeschooling them anyway. um I was thinking as you spoke, this was not on my line of questions here, but you said something that brought up reminded me of an act in Massachusetts in 1647, called the Old Deluder Satan Act. If you don't mind, can you? I mean, you're a lawyer. I'd assume you know about that one.
I do.
But do you mind sharing a little bit about it? And this was government compelling, as I think. I could be wrong. Um, and would you agree with that act or not?
Yeah. So Massachusetts had that act. This is the Massachusetts colony, right? At this time in the United States, there were religious establishments, state established churches, essentially. Massachusetts was one of the more pronounced establishments. And if you fast forward just a little bit, you can see that John Adams, who was our second president, was from Massachusetts, and he wrote much of the Massachusetts Constitution of 1776, whenever it was, and it had a high emphasis on state education. So this has been a historic thing in Massachusetts as a colony and as a state. But now let's look at whether or not, even if it's the old Deluder Satan Act cannot really be considered a secular expression of education, and whether it could be considered, just religious education, or an establishment, a further strengthening of a religious establishment. That all violates the same principle, and that is, who is the government, who is the colony, who are the colonial legislatures or the House colonial legislatures to tell people what they must know. And in Virginia, later on in 1776, they adopted a constitution, and Article 1, Section 16 of the Constitution says that religion, or the duty we owe to our Creator, and the manner of discharge must be based on reason and conviction, not force and violence. In other words, they recognize that in discharging duties to God, and not just some God, but the Creator God, that we are to be free to discharge them based on our own reason and our own conviction, not upon external force and coercion of the state coming in and mandating it. And this later led to James Madison's memorial and remonstrance against religious assessments that said the colonial government and the state government ought to have no business in taxing its people to distribute the money to approved religious groups, state approved religious groups, so that they can perpetuate the gospel. That's not right. That's contrary to the will of our Maker. And then Jefferson came along and introduced his bill for statute for religious freedom in 1786, which was passed, which said God made the mind free, and that all attempts by the civil magistrate to burden it are responsible for the worst abuses that mankind has known throughout the world, something like this. So they disestablished the state church. What does that mean? 4 elements of an establishment at law: compulsory attendance, In Virginia, you were mandated to attend the Anglican Church, the state established church, on the Sabbath. If you didn't, you were civilly fined. You had to pay over to the church a fine. In Virginia, it was the currency was tobacco, so you had to pay tobacco, a value of tobacco, to the local glebe, the local church. Compulsory attendance. And of course, today we have a compulsory attendance law for public schools. Compulsory curriculum. The Anglican Church, the Book of Common Prayer was the official prayer book. You could teach out of it, you could preach out of it, but you couldn't. It was nothing else was approved. It was the mandated book. And of course, in a compulsory education system, we have the state defines what is a minimum curriculum. They define what ideas will be taught. And you can't teach, religious ideas typically as true. You can teach them as history, but not even that's done. You can't teach them as true. So compulsory curriculum or compulsory ideas. Compulsory regulation of clergy. Only clergy, licensed, approved Anglican clergy could preach. You're a Baptist, go to jail. You're a Presbyterian, you better be on the other side of the Appalachians in rural Virginia, where nobody, no Anglican clergyman wants to go out there and rough it. But if they do, you're done. You Presbyterians are done. And the Baptists wrote a very good book on soul liberty, S-O-U-L, liberty. And, that they weren't going to be told whether they could meet or not. They weren't going to have their preachers approved by the government. So in a compulsory school, only licensed and approved certified teachers can teach. And just you were noting. And then the fourth element of establishment is compulsory subsidy. You had to pay taxes to the government, or your tithes went to the government and they redistributed it to their favorite sons. Catholic, no, you're not getting any money. Jewish, you're not getting any money. Hindu, you're not getting any money. It's only the approved Protestant sects. And so, well, that's bad. They should have given it to No, they shouldn't have been taking my money and giving it to promote religion. Nor should in the public schools, this is all tax supported dollars. In Michigan, I think every child you get 12 grand from the state that I have to pay to the state. And so if you want to disestablish the state school, you disestablish each of those elements. You eliminate compulsory attendance, you eliminate compulsory tax subsidy, you eliminate compulsory regulation of certification of teachers, and you eliminate compulsory curriculum. So Massachusetts, they went the other way. They doubled down, and they still double down today. But that's inconsistent. A state established school promotes ideas. A state established church promotes approved ideas. They're indistinguishable, in my opinion. Just because one's religious and one's secular doesn't change the fact that it's forcing children to be exposed by coercion to government approved ideas. That's the sin, that's the crime, that's the wrongdoing.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. That's very educational. I was thinking about it the other day myself, when I saw those numbers about reading. I have in the past defended the act, saying that the act was to help at least citizens be able to read. And it's interesting that today most of the citizens can't read above sixth grade level, and most of the people that are educated in the government schools. But as I continue to think about it, it's government mandated. Government has crossed into the family jurisdiction of the civil government has crossed into the family government jurisdiction, and that's um, un, unbiblical. So,
I might just add, if you really want to know what government control of education at the federal level looks like, if education was truly nationalized beyond the states, you need look no farther than the government control of education on Indian reservations historically and in the District of Columbia, where there is no state government. Congress oversees that through a local government. But if you studied the statistics, you'll see that the outage system where, religious organizations undertook the education of Indian children forcibly taken from their parents and taught Christianity, you'll see that this resulted in the destruction of Indian culture, Indian way of life, and all based on the idea that we know better than these Indians here, Native Americans, who are still teaching their children the backward ways of their people. That same mentality applies to all parents or many parents here today, that the national government, state governments think that they just don't know enough. And of course, why don't parents understand? Well, maybe did they go to a government school and graduate, and this is how they're not trained to train. So my book does address Indian education in the 1870s up through the 1900s. And of course, education was not compulsory until the turn of the century in the 1910, 1920. It swept through all the states and became compulsory. And of course, it was typically limited to 8 weeks in the winter because the children had to be there for the harvest and the planting in the spring and the harvest in the fall. And like Social Security, it'll never be more than 2%. So, well, it just kept growing and growing once it got institutionalized, and you had the unionization of teachers and contracts and wages and government control. So,
wow, yeah, I never thought about Washington D.C. and the Indian reservation. That's very interesting. So another thing that I found very interesting with your article was that basically beyond education itself, your argument is that the compulsory laws actually also interfere with family life. So, in other words, the government is not just controlling and forcing us to send their children, they're also, in a way, controlling our family and how we do things around this act that they're forcing us to do to begin with. So, can you elaborate on that a little bit for us?
sure, that's a very pragmatic concern that I think parents completely miss. What time should my children get up in the morning? I, as the head of the household, should have the authority to make that decision. I want them up early. I want them up later. Let them sleep. Let them get them up. Hard work. Blah blah blah. It's my call, based on what each of my children are like, what they need at this stage of their life and development and maturity and becoming an adult. When I have to send my children to a government school, particularly a private school, a public school, or a charter school, I have to get them up at a specific time so they can eat. If they eat breakfast, get them to the bus if they transport, get them to the school on time. And so my schedule is now controlled by the government. When I get up and what I must do and when I must do it. If I homeschool them, I can decide that I can decide the same schedule if I want. I can get them up when all the neighborhood children that go to a public school can get up. But I'm also free to say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do something else. We're going to have some family time. We're going to do this and this and this. And I can choose when to educate them. I can choose how long every day to educate them. I can choose not to educate them this day and have them go and do something in the yard or outside to be a child, and not be cooped up, particularly if my child is, hyperactive or ADHD or has autism or some special problem. I can customize my schedule for that specific child. Or my wife can do that, and as is typical in homeschooling, the wife takes most of this burden, and the husband is supposed to be financing it all. The same with after school. 3:30, I better be home when my kid comes home, or I better make sure I provide so that they don't come home to an empty house, latchkey kind of thing. I have to structure my household to that, and then they're going to be doing homework in the evening that the school assigned that must be due the next day, and this takes away from my planning of activities. I want to take a vacation. I'm sorry, but you can't take your kid out of a school for 3 weeks in, February to travel down south. You got to wait for a spring break, or you got to do this in the summer. Or so now when my social schedule and that of my family, what I think is good for them must be play second fiddle to the government. And when you think about it, the government controlled my schedule for 12 years as a child, and my family's schedule and my mother's schedule and my father's schedule. Sure, the employer controlled my father's schedule. He worked outside the home. That's a choice that was made, but it was voluntarily made. I want this employer. I like the benefits. I like the wage. I like the job. I'm going to stick with this. If I quit my job with my employer, I won't go to jail. I won't be charged with truancy from work.
Right.
There's other consequences, but at least it's voluntary in some sense. It's not voluntary in the other sense. So I'm captive. My house is captive. My schedule is captive. I cannot plan. I cannot decide. I must operate and work around the government school schedule. And that's a loss of freedom. That's a loss of familial independence. A lot of parents say, okay, that sounds good. I can do that because I don't have to educate my kids.
Yeah.
I don't have time. I don't make time. God gave them to me, but God, let's face it, I think the view is God screwed up. God screwed up because he knew I had to make money. He knew I have to get a job. He knows I have to work, and yet he gave me these kids, which I asked for, and he gave me, or came along because of, law of nature. But I don't really have any time. God didn't give me enough time to educate these children, and he didn't make it financially worthwhile. That's on God. God messed up. I'm doing my job, but I can't be expected to do all of this. And my view is, sorry, God didn't mess up. This is what's expected. These are your first priorities. Everything else must be operate around this. You can divide labor between husband and wife. You can pay a tutor to come in and tutor your children in those things you want. You can join a co-op and take your children on 2 days a week to the co-op and have them educated there by instructors you choose, in classes you desire, in ideas you want. So, these are all options and possibilities today. You don't like the books, the government, you go to a book fair. There's all over this country. Buy whatever books you want. Borrow books. People will loan you books.
Mm.
But, if I overbought, my mortgage is too big. We both must work. We're doing this for our children so they'll have a happy life. They'll have a good life. They'll have 3 square meals. They'll have a roof over their head, and their mind will be given to Caesar. That to me is a very false economy, because the physical is, will change. The physical environment will change, but the mind is a hard thing to convert. I don't know if you watched The Matrix when it came out. One of the things is that the mind is very powerful, and we don't free a mind after so many years, because it's just too hard, Neo, for them to grasp the freedom that we have. It's just hard. They just can't break out of the matrix thinking. And that's really what we've got here. It's hard for parents who were never told any of the things that we're discussing to break free from the social matrix that, I make sure my children are in church on Sunday and hear a good message of personal piety that has no relationship to everyday life. We go on family vacations in the summer at nice resorts. We have good food. We eat steak. We go out to dinner, whatever. The children have nice bedrooms. They have good lights and good reading and good books, and they have phones and computers, and I've taken care of them. It's just too bad they don't know God. And but church, 1 hour of church on Sunday versus 6 hours, 5 days a week. What kind of economy is that?
Of humanism.
Yeah, well, practical atheism is.
Charles Porter said something along the lines of what can 1 hour of Sunday school once a week and only to a fraction of children do basically against the week-long humanism that has been given to them in the schoolhouse. He said this in the 1930s. He was a humanist, contemporary of John Dewey.
Mhm.
So I just thought about another question as you were talking. You must be aware of Jeffrey C. Tuomala.
Yes.
Liberty University School of Law wrote, is it an article or?
So law review article.
Law review article. Is tax-funded education unconstitutional? Well, where do you land on that question, and why?
Well, I know Jeff Tamala. He retired now from his teaching at Liberty. Jeff filed his own brief through the Moral Law Institute, I think, with Roy Moore in the Mahmoud versus Montgomery County case that I mentioned earlier, the Supreme Court case. And he basically summarized that law review article that he wrote, saying, first of all, that a couple key things. First of all, the Supreme Court has no real good definition of religion. They believe religion is a function of sincerely held belief. He says, as a matter of law, Virginia's Constitution told us that religion involves duties we owe to our Creator, and the manner of discharge, which ought to be based on reason and not coercion. And so his thesis is that without an understanding of God's view of what religion is, and he believes that Virginia has articulated that in its Constitution, we're ever thrown into a quagmire of religious beliefs and this sort of thing. His second point is that, as I mentioned, is that God made the mind free, and it's God's will that it remain free and not subject to force and coercion in exposure to either Christian ideas or atheist ideas or humanist ideas, and that the public school system is the chief, if not the significantly principal means by which the government employs force and coercion and violence, i.e., we'll put you in jail or we'll fine you if you don't have your children in attendance, to, in fact, influence and control or direct the mind. As I mentioned, something God himself doesn't lay those penalties on people who don't want to hold his ideas. In any event, so Tamala's argument is therefore to tax people to support a system of coercion that denies their religious freedom, that is, denies the duty which parents owe to their creator to direct the education and upbringing of their own children, and to do it free from coercion and state control. He says that the taxing of an individual is to perpetuate this system of coercing and exposure to the mind of government approved ideas is unconstitutional. And I wholly subscribe to that view and support it, simply because it's one of the elements of an establishment. How do you know an establishment, a government establishment, when you see it in the area of ideas? Again, a religious establishment, compulsory attendance, compulsory certification of ministers, compulsory prayer book, compulsory subsidy or tithing, and the same with the government school, compulsory attendance, 180 days a year, typically, between 5 and 18 here in Michigan, unless you've graduated or been kicked out. Only certified teachers, taxes to support government education, and of course, mandatory curriculum defined by the legislature. Who is the legislature to tell me? Are they wiser people than I am? Did they get divine insight that I don't have as a parent? Did God open the heavens and inform their minds as to what is an ideally educated child, that they should use the force of law to compel exposure to those ideas? No, they are just as you and me. They're as sinful and fallen like everybody else, and they're not even the parent of the children. So who are they? They're nobody. They have no standing to tell us what we must believe. And of course, Tamala's article focuses on the tax side of it, the forced subsidy side of it. And, I've written elsewhere that focuses on the other three elements as well. But of course, that would require a state legislator to actually introduce a bill to disestablish the state school. If you think about that for a moment, even to talk like this, I've mentioned what it means to talk like this from the pulpit. Mm-hmm. I would say a very high percentage of the time that will result in dismissal of the pastor, if not a rebuke, and don't ever say that again. Think about it from a political point of view. My campaign is built on disestablishing the state school and forcing teachers, out of a job? No, there'll still be the same number of students after it's disestablished. There'll still be the same number of schools. It's just rearranging the financial system to make it a paid system. And if I don't want to pay $12,000 a year for the education of my child, I can do it myself. We can go into competition, with private schools, church schools, secular, humanist, non-government schools. Let the competition, for my dollars, not my tax dollars, let the competition for my tax dollars in the marketplace open the doors. You see nonprofit schools, you see for-profit schools, you know, and right now we don't really have that because we're free to pay nothing directly and only indirectly.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought it was an interesting take. Basically, the idea that all education is religious, and so if we're being made to pay for government education for a religion that we don't even agree with, that's obviously unconstitutional because it's by force, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
Um, how do we get this message to the pastors and to the churches? Because my view is that um, we won't get a real good buy-in from the people in the pews if the pastors are still confused about this.
Yeah, so that's an implementation question. You know, our goal at Lonang is to write and have materials available, like the article I sent you, that a person can download, print, and hand to their pastor saying, I read this, I don't know about it, I'm not persuaded, I'm unclear. Could you address this in a sermon? I think we have to realize that there's nothing particularly in a pastor's education or experience, certainly not in seminary, that would prepare a pastor to have any opinions about whether or not the civil government has a right to compel people to be exposed to ideas. They have no real training in the seminary about God's view that of freedom of the mind. Their seminary training is probably heavily discipleship and evangelism and personal growth. And this, of course, as you noted, Schaefer noted quite clearly that this has all been reduced and narrowed down to personal piety and individual decisions. Even to the extent it's pro-family. A good pro-family ministry is one that finds a place for each member of the family in my church, as opposed to how can we help your family fulfill the Genesis 2 and 3 mandates which God gave to every man and woman, not with only with respect to bearing children, but to provide them the means of survival with the land and giving every seed-bearing plant and all these things. It's, I don't know of any family ministry that talks about this universal duty of everybody out there in the pews. And what is God's will? God's will is that we obey this command to take dominion, to go into all the earth, not just for evangelism, but to, work our own land or have our own business or, at least be employable, an occupation, vocation. And this is God's will for our life. Guess what? God's will for your life is not merely a question of whether or not I go into ministry or I go and evangelize or I volunteer for the mission field. Those are certainly options, but that's merely one part of it all. As to a calling, but you can't expect to hand people the truth or these ideas and them to not having any training or background to instantly grasp it. The Holy Spirit's got to do its job here. Paul ran into this problem. He was speaking to the Greeks, and they all sat around all day and all they did is talk about ideas. And ultimately, he basically says, I'm the messenger, I'm preaching the truth. But God has got to convince you, he's got to move you. And, I have written another article called How Your Family Can Change the World in 7 Days, which is extremely unpopular and no one can accept it. It's very difficult to accept, but it basically, Monday, take your children out of the government school. Tuesday, write your pastor and say, since you've never addressed on how I can tear down every vain argument that sets itself up against God in the 15 years I've been going to your church, I am no longer giving you any money, and I'm no longer going to attend, and I'm going to find somebody that's serious about the whole counsel of God. So don't look for me Sunday. God bless you. Wednesday is I'm going to talk to my employer, and if my employer says, you better not mention religion in the workplace ever, and you better toe the line on DEI or whatever politically correct thing, and your social media post better not mention it, then it's time to say to that employer, I'm done. I'm going to trust God to find something else. Of course, don't quit until you have something else in hand. And then Thursday is like, hey, do I support the political parties in this country? They're like, are they helping me? Are they hurting me? What are they doing? Are they supporting the family? Write a letter to your political party and not another penny, not another vote, unless you start to actually enact laws and repeal bad laws, of which I'm going to provide you a short list, that impair my ability to follow God's command that I take dominion. Your zoning laws prohibit me from using my land in the way that God might want me to do. Your public school laws prohibit me or interfere with that right. I can name several of those. I'd have to look back to see what happens on Friday and Saturday. And then Sunday is don't do anything, take rest. You actually have a day of rest. But it's like that requires no mass program. It requires no government funding. It requires no nonprofit Christian organization to do anything, because those things are still within the complete power of every family right now. Those are what's left of the family's authority, but they can be exercised right now. So it's not a mass movement. It's just each family deciding it's time for a change. So
Yeah.
I haven't quite answered your question because I don't really know the magic, national media, but it's got to come from the bottom up. If the people don't care enough to confront their pastors, then they're not going to listen to me.
Yeah.
So,
Um. So we've been talking for a while now. Um. I know for sure there are some who um will dismiss us as, or dismiss what we're saying as far right Christian nationalist talk.
mhm.
What do you say to those people?
Well, the disestablishment of the state school or state control of education has nothing to do with Christian nationalism, because we're not proposing the government advocate anything. We're acting the government stop advocating. People use Christian nationalism to bash Christianity and Christian involvement in politics, but what they're really saying is, I am happy with secular nationalism, right?
Right.
I'm happy with the secular humanist nationalism that we have today, and I don't want any competition. Now, we shouldn't be, in my opinion, we're not talking about Christian nationalism, we're talking about freeing the mind, and we're talking about returning the family to its rightful authority. And that's what I would say on that score. And if people say it's just too much to take, I get it. There's nothing in your education that would, your education, your upbringing, your experience that would lead you to any other conclusion. And after, you're 20, 25 years old, 30 years old, it's very difficult to break out of the matrix. I get that. But on the other hand, I think God's attitude is, like in Romans 2, if you don't want to retain the knowledge of God in your mind, he'll give you over to what you do want to retain. And it's not a pretty picture. It's the same with parents. If you don't want to discharge your duties to God with regard to the education of your children, either directly or indirectly, then you're going to reap that. There's nothing you can do about it. You can't say, God, forgive me in 10 years. He's going to say, I'm sorry, you set it in motion. I'm not a magician. You might be able to, prevail somewhat, but, I'm not going to intervene magically or divinely to set aside your ignorant or willful disregard. You made your choices. You wanted to live at a certain lifestyle that prevented you, or maybe you were a single mom. I think this is the more strange case, the single mom. I just didn't have time. I had to work and I couldn't educate my children. Well, that's where your church and that's where your volunteers and that's where your nonprofit should have been stepping in and helping. And they're going to be held accountable. Did you go? Yeah, I went to my church. I went to my pastor, and he said, well, we don't want to compete with our public schools because the children are being salt and light, and we have Mrs. Smith and Mr. Jones and Mrs. Johnson, and they're all good Christian teachers in the public school, and so I don't want to, I'm sorry, you're okay. Why don't you explain that to the Almighty? No one wants to explain anything to the Almighty. I certainly don't want to explain what I've done to the Almighty. So it's not a good situation.
Yeah. Yeah, I find that like you said, I believe Christians should have a distinctly Christian philosophy of education. I believe that education is inherently political. And I agree with the statement that I believe it's attributed to Abraham Lincoln, that the philosophy of the classroom in one generation is the philosophy of the government in the next. As I said earlier, I believe education is discipleship. There's no distinction, which is why it should be with the parents and the community of believers for Christians. So I think seminaries should begin to take seriously the idea that pastors should at least know how to think about these things. Pastors should be able to help parents to navigate the educational decisions. I don't think public school is an option for Christians, because that is in fact to partner with the enemies of God to educate the children. God has called us to teach them, train them up in the way they should go. The government is teaching them to go in the way the government wants them to go, and that's the direct opposite of what God has called us, what God requires of us. So,
and even if they were doing the will of God by teaching the truth, they can't employ the means of force to effectuate it, because you can't use force to compel people to be exposed or believe. So again, that would be like, even if the curriculum was read the Bible every day. As long as it's mandatory, it violates the principles of the law of God. And I think pastors, they need to be taught in seminaries, they need to be taught jurisdiction, the right to speak the law, law, diction, speak. Who has the right to speak the law in the area of education? Parents have it. It was given to the family. Government doesn't have it. Church doesn't have it. Church has no power at all over anyone, least alone not over any souls, and certainly not over any ideas, and certainly has no authority over the family. It's a total voluntary association, and its structure is very well defined in the scripture. There's Jesus Christ, and then there's everybody else. There's no pastor laity distinction that we've had. We have offices, elders, deacons, because Paul talked about it, but these have no more authority than any parishioner or member or non-member or any person in the body. To the extent that the local church is incorporated under state law and has trustees and owns property and has a bank account, that has nothing to do with the Church of Jesus Christ. That is a man-made institution. God did not write the articles of incorporation of any church. He did not write the bylaws. He did not appoint its officials or its pastors. I'm sorry, they are called by a congregation or corporation. God didn't write the Nonprofit Corporation Act. These are all man-made things, and we're permitted to have these, but we must not confuse any of these things with the Church of Jesus Christ. And, God will take care of his church despite the best efforts of its parishioners and its leaders.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That's another thing that makes it, this whole idea, like, I was listening to this guy Morgan, and he sounded really bad, but after he just said that, it was like, I can't believe anything he says. He's just he must hate Christians, or he must hate pastors, or he must hate school teachers, or no, I'm telling you, this is God's point of view. If you want to argue about it, then tell me where I'm wrong. Tell me that God likes men to usurp his power, his authority, and that the way God gave authority to the family to educate the children was wrong or mistaken, or God didn't foresee the needs and all these problems, and the Almighty messed up. If that's your position, let me know, and I might disagree with you, but otherwise you can't just change his approach to things. You can't do that. And it has nothing to do with nationalism. It has everything to do with obedience.
Yeah.
And, we're trying to get freedom for people, not more coercion.
Yeah. And I mean, you make a compelling argument. People would disagree with a lot of the things you've said and written. I will link this article in the show notes so people can read it for themselves, as well as the other one that you reference, titled how your family can change the world in 7 days.
Okay.
Yes. Just so people can go there for reference and to see a fuller picture of what we're talking about here. But I know people will disagree, not because what you're saying or what your article said is not true, but because in my view, accepting what you're saying requires the kind of action that most people, the price required to pay is most people are not looking to pay that price. So it's much easier to stay in the familiar Um, but I don't think I can't see how anybody would really um, go about disagreeing with a lot of the things that you've said. So, do you have, sir, any last remarks? Any closing argument?
You know, as an attorney, every case I'm in, there's an opposing view. Somebody says I'm wrong, and they try to persuade a judge. So I'm not too shaken or worried that somebody has a different point of view. That's this is the normal water in which I swim. So you know, on the other hand, it's very difficult to reason a person out of a position into which they've never reasoned to begin with. You know, if a person says, I hold this position for the following reasons, at least we can address the reasons. But if they don't have any reasons, you know, you could have a mountain of evidence, but what are you doing? You're trying to reason a person out of a position into which they first never reasoned themselves. So you're just talking in the wind, you know. I can prove this. Well, it's not a matter of proof. It's just I believe it. Okay. Well, don't believe it. Here's the consequences of belief. But I think the big picture is this. We've been talking about education. Education is really the major component of recovering the authority of the family, you know, and that's really what my general focus is on is what does God ask the family to do? What does he require them to do? What does he permit them to do? And how is that impaired in this American society? It's impaired in every society, but you know, in American society, their duty to educate their children is impaired by government compulsion. Um, their duty to use their land, you know, and plants and crops and the things and their property, their real estate and their personal property, the way God wants them to, is impaired by zoning laws. It's impaired by a great many regulations about permitted uses, and so if you're, you know, parents in many countries or some countries, a parent's authority to bear children is regulated by the state in terms of how many you can have and under what circumstances. Uh, how can a family do what God asked them to do if the government is interfering with each of these fundamental propositions? So even if a person says, "Well, I'm kind of halfway there on education," then when they get the other issues, it's like, "Oh my goodness, I can't. This is too much of a package deal. I can't handle it." But that's all right. I don't mind that. They don't have to account to me. Nobody has to tell me or account to me. I'm nobody in the larger scheme of things. But they do have to account to God. And if I'm wrong, then good for them. If I'm right, then it won't be so good for them. But in this life, it'll be bad for them, in my opinion, if they turn their education of children over to the state, because if they're not going to be taught the truth, they'll believe a lie, and that will go bad for the parents in their older years. Um, you know, you made me go to a government school. I'm going to make you go to I'm going to move you out of your house, and I'm going to put you in a
Facility.
facility. I'm going to, you know, I can't be bothered. I'm busy. I'm really busy, Dad. I'm really busy, Mom. You know, I got my own kids. I got my house. I got my mortgage. I got my job. I got car payments. You know, I got the boat payment. I got that vacation I have to take. First of all, I don't have room for you here, and I can't take you in. And secondly, you'll be better off anyway with other people. And you know, yeah, you may be, but you know, you're going to force me into that, or you know, what about family and love? And not that there's one supermodel, but these are concerns you ought to think about. Maybe you educate your children at home and they turn out to be rotten. Are there any guarantees? No, they're not. But I think statistically you have a better chance. at least educating yourself, even if you don't know what you're doing, but it's not a guarantee. There's no guarantees. Just like in marriage, I love you, you love me, but if it doesn't work out, there's some problem that the parties can't overcome, God has rules and demands we obey them, but it's hard. I don't know. I want to be human about this, but I don't want to say my failures or anyone's failures justify defiance and disregard of the duties we owe to him as family members, as husbands of wives, and parents with regard to their children. So that's my summary, and I'm sticking with it,
Amen.
Your Honor.
Amen. Sir, we have had very good conversations. I want to thank you for coming on here to talk to me, but I also want to thank you for the work that you have put in to communicate this very important message. And I know without a doubt, if you don't mind, I would like to talk to you again with a follow-up conversation, because I have a lot more questions where the ones I asked you came from. So we should do this again soon. But until then, I want to thank you and say, have a good night.
Well, thank you for having me on. I look forward to any future conversations you want to have. Hope your listeners are edified.
Yes, sir. I hope so too. Thank you.
Yep. Bye now.
Bye-bye. All right, folks. So that was it. Thank you so much for hanging in there with me. I know this is a long conversation. Like I said, I'm going to link some of the things that we reference in this podcast in the comments below. If you hang in there this long with me, please, please, please leave a comment below, leave a review on the podcast, share this message with somebody else, and I will see you in the next episode. Peace.